colleagues who have joined us to form the Emergency Coalition in support of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Dozens of NGOs from around the world, from the human rights, development, environment, and Indigenous rights communities have joined together to express our complete support for our Indigenous colleagues and friends and communities in their long struggle to achieve global recognition for the rights of Indigenous peoples. And yet, we are also saddened today and outraged at our reasons for being here. This coalition has come together in only a few weeks to address what we consider to be an appalling situation of human rights hypocrisy. The efforts of the governments of Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, all developed nations with long histories of activity at the United Nations, and for Canada and New Zealand in particular, with well-known records in support of human rights. With this in mind, we are stunned by the efforts of these governments, in particular to derail and weaken one of the most important human rights documents to come before the United Nations since its founding in 1945, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. After 22 years of negotiations and acceptance, just last year in the newly formed United Nations Human Rights Council, the Declaration deserves the support of all nations in the UN, but especially those nations who claim to be promoters of global human rights. 22 years of negotiations is a long time, but it is nothing compared to the centuries of discrimination, abuse, treaty violation, displacement, and cultural and physical genocide that has been perpetrated against the thousands of communities and nations of Indigenous peoples around the globe. It is well past time that 370 million Indigenous people in 5,000 communities and nations that still exist today receive the basic human rights protections that will help them persevere, preserve their societies, governments, languages, cultures, and lands that they haven't inhabited since the beginning of our time here. We are not so naive to think that the fact that so many Indigenous peoples' territories are in areas that contain rich natural wealth, prime targets for mining, logging, and other extractive industries, has nothing to do with the reluctance of some nations that have traditionally supported human rights on all fronts. We are calling on these nations now, and today on the governments of Canada, New Zealand, and Australia to join the global NGO community, indeed the majority of the global government community, in support of this declaration that is long overdue. It will never repair the unacceptable damage that has already been done to the Earth's first peoples. However, it will at the very least, and most importantly, afford them the rights, future protections that will ensure that their essential governments, ways of life, and relationships to the Earth will endure on into the future generations. Thank you. I'd like to ask our colleague Craig Benjamin from Amnesty International Canada to present a statement on behalf of Amnesty International.
Has earned a reputation as a global champion of human rights. They used this reputation and promised to build upon this reputation when they stood for election to the Human Rights Council. Well, they've broken that promise. Canada led an initiative at the Human Rights Council against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And today they continue to lobby against its adoption.
Shame on Canada.
Shame on Canada. I'm here on behalf of Amnesty International, a human rights movement of more than 2 million members in more than 150 countries around the world. And we stand firmly behind the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But we are far from alone. We have worked in the United Nations with organizations like the Quaker World Committee, with IWGIA, with the Netherlands Center for Indigenous Peoples. We have worked alongside a growing number of civil society organizations represented here by this letter, and the number of people around the world speaking out and demanding respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples is growing steadily. And that's not all. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has endorsed this declaration. UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples has endorsed this declaration. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has endorsed this declaration. And most interesting of all, senior Canadian officials who reviewed this declaration also endorsed it. And yet, the government of Stephen Harper has come out in opposition to the declaration. And the reasons that they have offered are the same recycled arguments that Canada rejected in 20 years of negotiation of the declaration. The same proposals they make for amendment are the same recycled proposals that New Zealand and Australia tabled years ago and were firmly rejected by the majority of states participating in this process. So what's going on here? Why is human rights being politicized? Why is Canada jeopardizing its reputation and its influence on the world stage? It's not too late. Canada can take another course. Canada can support this declaration. Canada should do so. Canada must do so. The world relies on Canada to be a champion of human rights. Canada must support the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you.
My friend and colleague, Chief Wayne Muniz from Hobbema in Alberta, to stand with me today. I wanted to begin by thanking the organizers. The Assembly of First Nations is a representative of First Nations, 633 First Nations communities in Canada. And on behalf of Indigenous peoples in Canada, we would like to thank you standing with us today. To challenge the Government of Canada and its position in not supporting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Canada is a member of the Human Rights Council. And when the vote was held on June 29, 2006, Canada voted against the Declaration. It's completely wrong. Today, we stand here with all of you to call on Canada to do the right thing. And when the vote comes in September on the Declaration, to stand on the right side of this issue and to vote in support of the Declaration, not in opposition. I'd like to present to you a petition with some 22,000 names put together and organized by Amnesty International. We want to present this to the Government of Canada to ensure that voices all over the place are being heard on this issue. So it's important. The Declaration is important for Indigenous peoples in Canada and worldwide because it sets minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of our peoples. And that is the reason why we're so adamant and so passionate about this Declaration being adopted. So thank you, all of you, and we really appreciate the support that